You are muted, Jasmine.
Are we starting?
Yeah. Niyati ma'am, is it fine? We should begin?
Sure.
Sure. Okay.
Good evening to all. A very warm evening to our chief guests. Welcome all to the book launch and a discussion on Ahalya by Koral Das Gupta. My name is Jasmine Singh and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Ms. Koral Das Gupta for today's discussion. Ms. Koral, who is an author, a columnist, and an academic, is also known for founding an online platform called tellmeyourstory.biz, where budding authors can share their original stories. She has authored many books with publishers like Rupa and Neogi and has been currently associated with Pan Macmillan. Today, we have gathered here for the book launch of Ahalya, the first book in the Sati series, which shall focus upon the mythological characters of Kunti, Draupadi, Mandodari, Tara, and Ahalya herself. In subsequent parts, ma'am, we welcome you. I'd also like to welcome Ms. Niyati Pandey, who is a faculty at the Gujarat National University, Gandhinagar. We are very grateful, ma'am, that you could take out time for hosting today's discussion. Ma'am is a very avid reader and a keen writer and has published many research papers. Ma'am, we welcome you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine.
Before proceeding, I request all the audience to keep their microphones muted and cameras off during the discussion. A Q&A session will be organized at the end of the discussion. Please ask questions through the chat box at that time only. Thank you for joining the event. Now I'd like to hand over to Ms. Niyati and Ms. Koral.
Firstly, welcome Koral ji on behalf of Think India. I extend a warm welcome to you. And at the outset, I'll also thank Think India for especially Ganesh ji and Aditya ji for making me a part of this conversation. Because the theme of your book, Koral ji, Ahilya, is very close to my heart. As a woman, I have always felt that probably a woman in all of her manifestations, be it a mother or a daughter or a wife or a sister, she understands the needs of all those who are around her. And it's not just with women, but it's also with all other species that we see around us. You take an example of a cow, and if the calf is hungry, she'll get restless. She'll come to know that her calf is hungry. But then the point is that I have also realized that women, if they can understand about others' needs, can't they even understand or infer what they actually want? So it's not that they don't know what they want, but they are placed in such a position because of our tradition, because of our practices, that they don't raise their voice or they don't understand what their need is. And I have felt after reading your book that those who, and even realized how Ahilya has been depicted so far in our history, that any woman who stands for herself and takes a choice is labeled as Ahilya. And Ahilya has become so iconic for me now that she was initially for me a symbol of patriarchy, where she was cursed by a man, then waited for a man to come down and restore and redeem her dignity. And I am looking forward to see how you, Koral ji, have freed Ahilya out of the shackles of patriarchy. And it's very important that, you as an author, to, tell a brief about you, although we'd like to hear it from you also, that Koral ji has a very wide area of experience. She has a diverse writing area and even more diverse and dynamic professional life. And her latest book, Ahilya, is a part of a 5-series book, Sati series, that is being published by Pan Macmillan. She is a literary entrepreneur, and I welcome her and congratulate her for her book, Ahilya, and wish her all the success on my personal behalf and on behalf of Think India. So, ma'am, I would like you to tell us more about yourself.
I think you and Jasmine have already introduced me very warmly. Thank you so much for that. As you both mentioned that I am an author, primarily that is my identity, that is who I am in my profession and in my, that is where my professional and spiritual identity is, that I am an author. Other than that, I run a storytelling platform. It's a story network or a story laboratory, as I call it. It's called tellmeyourstory.biz, where we do a lot of experiments with stories, their possibilities, the kind of things that can happen with a story, and the kind of ways in which a story can change a particular society. We try to do all of that. We are constantly churning out new ideas from our brains, and we try to put those into action. As an author, I have mythology and philosophy has been a part of my writing often, though not as directly as now that I am doing the Sati series. The Sati series was just, it was a flickering idea, you can say, it was a flame. And it just came to me, and I had proposed it to Pan Macmillan, and the idea just connected with both of us, and we jumped in, and within a year, the first book is out.
Okay. So while going through the book, it's a part of Panch Kanya series. So, my first question after seeing the cover page of your book is, why Panch Kanya?
Niyati, what I often feel is that in every era that we have traversed in history, the most fundamental questions that has come to every intellectual is, who am I? And secondly, where do I come from? And in every era, depending upon the politics of that era, we have tried to find ourselves, we have tried to discover ourselves, we have tried to frame ourselves somewhere that this is who I am. And depending on that, we have, cut our pursuits. Now, where I stand, when I look back, I figure that our history, our mythological history is very rich. It's very rich. But till now, every era has its own communications, its own way of talking, its own way of explaining things the way they are. So obviously, a lot of things have changed as per that. When the question that is more, what I say that these are the two most fundamental and existential questions, that who am I and where do I come from? The question is even more haunting for a woman, because the social and cultural distinctions in gender are becoming more and more prominent as we are getting increasingly conscious of our sexuality in this era. We are trying to express ourselves fearlessly and unapologetically. Now, the impression we carry of our past shapes our future. And the Sati series will probably give wings to those impressions, introducing India as a mystic land with sensuous legends in its myth, who are spiritually active. They are not dominated or intimidated by impositions of patriarchy. This, I believe, should inspire the youth. It should lend strength to the youth today. And such inspiration should not be restricted only to women. It will be spread across the entire generation. So it was very important for me to pick up Panch Kanya and develop it into the Sati series.
So the way you have described it, the Panch Kanya, seems to be very unique. So I just want to know, I'm very inquisitive about it, that how did you actually get the idea of Panchkanya? How did it strike you? Was it a eureka moment or a conscious process that, over time you have selected your Panchkanya? I would like you to throw some light on it. That why a Panchkanya? Who are these Panchkanyas?
I didn't select the Panchkanya. Panchkanya is a term used in the epics. So it is, Panchkanya was a term given to 5 women, Ahalya, Kunti, Draupadi, Mandodari, Tara. And in some retellings, in some areas across the country, Kunti has been replaced by Sita. That is in some retellings. But in the original verse of the epic, it is written that Ahalya, Kunti, Draupadi, Mandodari, Tara are the Panchkanya. Now, scholars, and again, it's not me, I didn't do the translation. Scholars, very renowned, well-known scholars have translated Panchkanya as 5 virgins. And that is when it struck me that, when I look at Panchkanya, so you were talking about Ahalya, you were talking about Kunti, you were talking about Draupadi. Mandodari and Tara, you might know less. But these 3, at least you know a little bit about them. Even if you know Kunti and Draupadi, you know extensively. Ahalya, you may not know that much, but you know a little bit about where the context comes from. So these 5 women, they have had partners other than their husbands. And still, they are called Kanya, which has been translated as virgins. So it's a natural connect. It's an immediate hook that you are drawn towards, trying to explore that why are these women called virgins? They're not virgins. And when you know that, when you come across to that, you are naturally drawn to explore this more, trying to figure that what does virginity mean. And from there, that entire, text shapes up. That what is virginity? Why have the epics called these 5 women Panchkanyas? And who are the Panchkanyas? The epics say that these Panchkanyas are the 5 satis. Sati means the purest one. So you are telling that these 5 are the purest? You are telling that these 5 are virgins? Why would you say that when the texts themselves, the stories themselves are saying something which doesn't go with our traditional definitions of virginity, of purity? That was something worth exploring.
So, I'll come to virginity later, but I'll come to Sati first. You have referred the Panchkanyas as Sati, and Sati and a very utopian connotation in our culture. It's a very ideal form of a woman, who's referred to as Sati. How have you conceptualized Sati? For you, or in your Panchkanya series, who exactly is Sati?
What exactly is Sati is a very important part of the book, though it's not huge. It doesn't take too many pages, but it makes a very important statement in the middle and towards the end of the book. Sati here, I have tried to understand Sati without attaching or without restricting them to just their bodies. Sati is something, where you try to understand a woman from the context of how free she is in her thoughts, how liberated she is in her thinking, how accommodative she is in her, how flexible, actually, that is the word I was looking for, how flexible she is in her thoughts, how flexible she is in her actions, whether she is rigid or she is far more liberated in the way she conducts herself. How much at ease she is about her shortcomings, how fine she is with her strengths. Is she arrogant, or she is more detached? Is she just a beautiful woman, or there is far more behind her beauty? And you get in touch with that beauty only when you interact with that person. She is not imposing her beauty, her knowledge, her wisdom on you by trying to tell you that she is, by trying to dominate you. Sati is the woman who probably you would not even notice. But when you actually interact with her, you get to know how deep she is. Sati may be a person like you who is at a very high, she is doing very well in her career, trying to do the right things that she should be doing at the position that she holds. Someone who is doing the right thing, uh, given the virtue of the position that she has been trusted with. And Sati could be a homemaker uh, who is very careful about the dependence that people have on her and hence giving herself a little more than the others. Just before we started this discussion, you were talking about women and the way they give themselves to the needs of others and probably suppress their own needs. I feel that when you were talking about that, I was just thinking that that part of women will probably never go, because that is the beauty of women. That is hormonal. It's not. There's nothing that a woman can do and a man can't do, or there's nothing that a man can't do and a woman can't do. Having said that, the fact that your child gets maximum happiness when he or she is with you is something that is unlikely to change, because as a woman, you would see the needs of a child far more than a man can. And that is hormonal. That is nature. That is not something that has been imposed by patriarchy. That is nature. We have done ourselves a disservice by thinking that that is also patriarchy. So today there is a huge discussion in feminism that we must change that. And that is the most future destructive thing to do if you are trying to play with nature. I think that should be my idea.
Thank you for sorting that out, actually. Now, this is with reference to the virginity point that you brought in. And, it's very pertinent. Even in our today's time, you're facing this question again and again. That is virginity a sign of sacredness? How do you relate Sati with Panchkanya? Because Panchkanya simply means, it simply translates to 5 virgins. And why do we call them Kanya? Why do we need to refer to them as virgins or Kanyas? Because it is very similar to the Christian theology of Virgin Mary, referring to the mother of Christ as Virgin Mary. So we have come across this. Now, so this is what my question is, that why virginity is so important. Is it necessary that to be sacred, you need to be virgin? So the idea is with controlled sexual desires.
Niyati, the little bit of understanding that I have of this, I can first share that with you. Ancient Hindu texts never considered virginity, or never actually, virginity is a sub context. Ancient Hindu texts never saw a human being or anybody, any kind of being, simply as a person with a body. They have always considered the soul as the superior being, right? The body is only a temporary framework that holds the soul, and at some point of time, it releases the soul. So the body doesn't define the soul, as it is. All Hindu texts have time and again say that the body is a part of a mind. The mind is not a part of a body. And we have made that mistake again and again, thinking that mind is only this part, right? So mind is only this part, which is a part of the body. It's a very wrong way of thinking it. The body, rather, is a part of the mind. So when it comes to, well, this is the broadest connotation that you can think of, the way you can define a being. Human existence comes as a set of that being. Now, when you think of it, when we talk virginity, the Hindu philosophies doesn't consider virginity as a physical construct, as a bodily construct, as a material construct at all. It doesn't. It considers virginity as a far more spiritual construct. So it is all about the virginity of your soul, the purity of your soul. Virgin, the word virgin means you are untouched, right? So when you take this virginity construct to your soul or to your mind, it means that whatever happens around you hasn't been able to change you from the person that you wanted to be, right? When we think about ourselves, we think about ourselves as the most beautiful one, right? We think about ourselves as the most beautiful one from the way we see ourselves in the mirror. And that is where our myopic vision lies, that we just see ourselves in the mirror and we want to be the most beautiful one. When we take that mirror away, and what we all have to do is we have some hands, we have two hands, we have two legs, we have a body. We can't see this part. Since we can't see this part, we only have our hands and legs to do something. That is when we start working. That is when we forget the mirror. And that is when we try to bring something substantial to the table. That is, on a broader context, termed as goal. A lot of us don't know what our life goals are. Many of us don't know. We don't know that what are our life goals. We don't know that what we should, how we want our life to move. And that's perfectly okay. But the fact is, when you don't know why you have come to earth, you are constantly grappling. You are constantly trying to find that. Today you are interested in something, tomorrow you are interested in something else. You get very agitated. You will see that today in the society, in social media especially, that people are so agitated. You know, I don't need to take the names. You know who are the people who are so agitated, who are constantly complaining, who are constantly shouting. That is because they haven't found themselves. They are not aware of who they are. Had they been aware, they wouldn't have to shout from rooftops. They wouldn't have to use abusive language to define themselves and to make themselves heard. Have you ever seen Sadhguru shouting? A person who knows who he is. Sadhguru is a far bigger person. But even in our regular lives, a person who is aware of who he is, and that he doesn't allow that to change in his own brain by what others talk about him, is Sati. The person who feels successful because of the good work that he does, without being affected by others who constantly make him feel that he is not good enough, is the person who has achieved success in life. For others, you will probably agree, and this I have read and heard in many Eastern and Western discussions, that most of the goals that we look for ourselves, a big house, a big car, as materialistic as these, or something which is even some of our spiritual goals, that we will do this, we will do that, are often not our own goals. They are things that others in our peer group have done, people in social media has done, and we felt that, oh my God, this is really cool. I must go for this. This will really make me feel very cool. But that is not our personal goal. That was not what I really wanted to do. That was not something that I really enjoyed. So you start doing it. And at some point of time, you start having that bitterness inside you because that person was not you. You have picked it up as a need because you felt that others are doing and they are doing it very well. So if I do that, I will reach their success. I will become like them. And so what they have achieved in their life will also come to me. And so I will also have 1 million followers on Twitter. You might have 1 million followers on Twitter, or you might not make it at all. You are stuck with 220. But end of the day, what happens is you grow very bitter because that was not the person that you yourself really wanted to be. That is someone else. You picked up that goal. You defined that success for yourself without looking into yourself, trying to figure who you were, what you are. That is the difference. That is what virginity is all about. that you are immune, you are untouched by what? By the way that others are trying to define you. You are your own definition. The day you have understood it, you are virgin, you are the same. That doesn't need to be a feminine construct. It is a human construct.
Undoubtedly, this is one of the most profound explanation of virginity and sati that I have heard so far. Connecting this and coming to Ahilya. Ahilya, for most of us, all those who are here, who are even here, or who have watched Ramayana or who have read Ramayana or Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas, have always, have always thought of Ahilya as a woman who was punished by her husband, waited for Lord Ram, again a man, to come and redeem her with dignity. How have you constructed Ahilya in your book? Is it different? Have you provided a different approach to Ahilya for us?
I haven't broken away from the basic framework of the story of Ahilya that everybody knows. I didn't want to introduce any kind of shock. I have remained within the boundaries of the original story of Ahilya. Having said that, Ahilya is a very small story in that entire huge universe of Ramayana, and I have probably zoomed it out and written it. While doing that, of course, I had a few dots to connect, and in between the dots, I have spread my wings, flew as much as I could. But one thing about Ahilya that struck me very, very deeply was the fact that Ahilya knew right from the beginning what she wanted. So let me give you a very small context of this, right? The texts say that Ahilya has been, Indra had come and he had taken Ahilya against the will of her husband, and some texts say that against Ahilya's will as well. Ahilya didn't want, she was strict, right? Now, if you read Ahilya, you would know that Ahilya was not born from a woman. She was she was Brahma's child. Brahma constructed Ahilya. Ahilya was not naturally conceived daughter of Brahma. So Brahma was the father and also the mother, right? Now Brahma wanted that so when Brahma is the lone constructor, I have shown Brahma as the sculptor of Ahilya. Now when Brahma is the only one giving birth to a mystical, beautiful woman and named her Ahilya, the moment you say beauty, you immediately connect that person or that thing to Indra. Indra is the god of illusion. Indra is the god of illusion. Indra is your impulse. So the moment you create something beautiful, you have immediately transferred the rights to Indra. So right from her birth, when she was not even born, her body was getting constructed. You had inch by inch weaved Indra within her without realizing, because you wanted your construction to be the most beautiful on earth, right? And with that arrogance, you didn't realize that you have weaved Indra inside her inch by inch. And once she grows up, you want her to follow a particular pattern of your choice. And you don't know that you have weaved Indra within her, which now she cannot separate from. She is devoted to that deity. She is beautiful. She will naturally attract Indra, and she will be attracted to Indra. Why? Because Indra is illusion, and illusion is beautiful. Beauty is illusion. Illusion is beautiful, and beauty is illusion. So they are disinterweaved, and you cannot separate the both. So by the time this was realized, or actually that was never realized, by the time Indra came, Ahalya probably didn't even recognize Indra as a separate person or a separate being. She felt that she was with the one who she was destined to be with. So how is Ahalya? What is Ahalya's infidelity in that? So I would not give out more. I think I should restrict to that.
So I understand. Now, one more aspect that I read in a book, and I understood that I need more. I would like you to say throw some light upon it. When you say that Ahilya had guided herself, because you said that Brahma was her father and mother both, and she was all alone before meeting Rishi Gautam. So she guided herself through the womanhood and seeking wisdom from nature.
Yeah.
So I know that what feminine elements of Ahilya looked upon to gain wisdom or to grow herself.
Okay. Again, see, Hindu texts have always considered nature to be more powerful than man. All the gods and goddesses that you can think of, Surya, Chandra, Indra, Varun, all of them are actually nature. So when Ahalya goes back to nature, right, and nature has been created by whom? Heaven. Who is the Lord of heaven? Indra. Who does she go to? In absence of a mother, when she is seeking that feminine strength, she is going to nature, which has been constructed by the god, which has been blessed by the heaven. And the ruler of the heaven is Indra. And she is going to all those feminine forces like river, like mist, all of which are forms of water. And Indra is the god of water again, because Indra brought water to earth by fighting with the demon Vritra, right? So you understand that at every step of her being, she just couldn't escape Indra. Nobody can escape Indra. He is the ruler of that part of the universe which is ruling upon the earth. You cannot escape Indra. Now, in various parts of the Vedas, Indra has been explained differently. For example, when you look at this particular Ahalya story, till now, or when we were small, the way we had been explained Ahalya by our seniors, we have seen the regressive part of Ahalya's story, because that was the politics of that generation. In our yesterday generation, women saw themselves in a particular way. In this generation, the politics of women has changed. The politics of femininity, the politics of gender has changed. So we are more open to look at the mythological texts in a broader context. So now when you look at it, now when you look at the way nature has been defined, in the way nature has been employed in the language, the way gods has been defined and used, you figure that each and everything is so delicately interwoven that you can't escape it. So one point that comes very strongly to me while writing this, and now I have just completed the first draft of Kunti as well. What I figure is that Indra is a great force, and Indra is the god of illusion. Now, how do you look at illusion? Think of yourself that how do you fantasize? Your fantasizing is very personal, right? So is everybody else's. What happens inside your head as your fantasy, nobody else knows. And that is your Indra, right? So for every person, Indra is different. If you want to feel that Indra is a philanderer, he is a philanderer. If you feel that Indra is the king of the Devas, he is the king of the Devas. If you feel that Indra is the most handsome one, he is the most handsome one. It depends upon who are you. Depending upon you, your identification of Indra will change. It's your identity that identifies Indra. And that is the most, fascinating part and the mystic part of mythology.
So, this is not once that, you have given this amazing interpretation. There's another aspect that I've come across that you have given a very fascinating connotation to Ahilya in the form of stone. So I just wanted to know, what is the cognitive premise of Ahilya as a stone as created and narrated by you? Because I'm asking this keeping in mind Pashan, the stone, Ahilya's stone, is a symbol of lifelessness, has a very negative connotation. She was taken away of her senses, but you have depicted in a very positive sense. So, I'm very intrigued about this interpretation. So I would like to know about it.
Sure. Stone again is a part of nature. It's not man-made. It's natural, right? So by reducing by that curse, something that is called a curse, Gautam cursed Ahalya to become a stone, a rock, reduced to a rock. That is, when we were children, we were told that Gautam cursed Ahalya that she would be reduced to a rock. Gautam made Ahalya a part of nature. Nature, which text has introduced as God. So in his curse, Gautam has elevated Ahalya from her human form to a godly form, from worldly existence to a natural godly existence, right? On the planet Earth. So first point is that curse of Gautam, which we call curse, actually elevated Ahalya from a human existence to a godly existence. Secondly, if you look at a stone, just like you say, Pashan. Pashan is another word. Every word, again, Hindu philosophy says that there's nothing which has a one-track way of looking into things. Everything has dual explanations, right? So a stone, I have given a positive explanation. There are the word Pashan, which has been used by many literary and other users, has been used Pashan, which means lifelessness, which means rigid. Now, the way I look at it, a stone is something that stands somewhere in detachment. You put the stone somewhere, people are crossing it, they are not watching it. The stone is in its place, it is not moving. Come rain, come water, come storm, the stone might break, the stone might move, but it will remain as it is, right? It will not change its form all of a sudden. It will not try to protect itself, which means the stone attains some kind of detachment. And in this entire story, there are only three characters, right? Ahalya, Gautam, and Indra. Who was the one who was praying for detachment? Gautam. He was a sage. In his curse, he has given everything to Ahalya and God. And he didn't realize that all the years of penance that he had observed, year after year, trying to build him up as sage Gautama, who would one day become a part of the Saptarishi, one day who would rule the constellations, has given away his biggest strength, the attainment of all his years, in one curse that he has given to a woman.
Probably now I can make a perfect connect between Sati and stone or Pashan. How you have beautifully, displayed the idea of Sati as somebody who is unconnected, who is not affected, and a stone. I can gauge it now. And one final question from my side. Keeping in mind the audience that we have here, and one of the most challenging questions that even I have come across while interacting with people around, that in contemporary times, how do you think Ahilya as a historical figure, her life and her decisions can guide the idea of feminism Because do you think that your Panchkanya series can provide an alternative, an Indic way to challenge patriarchy rather than the Western idea of feminism, which I feel is alien to our way of life?
You know, the way I see it, women have always been change agents, irrespective of wherever they come from, right? Uh, I mean, right at a very domestic level, if you see, you as a woman, think of how many changes you have brought within your system to make things better. And it is not that you have just tried to change the color of your of the walls of your house, right? You have done far more than that. Everybody does. Women are natural change makers, and that is across the world, not irrespective of east or west. Given that, Ahalya I see is the more tranquil form of a rebel vis-a-vis a aggressive form of rebel. And that tranquil form of rebel is very Indian. That is Indian soft power, right? That you are trying to change something, but you don't necessarily have to be aggressive about it. You don't necessarily have to be breaking things. You don't have to be not loving the people around you. That is very, very deeply embedded in India. That is how we define ourselves, our culture. Indian culture that we say, that we have been very proud about, that for us, family is very important. The idea, think of the way we have seen our mothers and grandmothers perform. They always tried to bring a change, but they were very, very restrained in the way they spoke. They didn't speak their mind the way it erupted. Rather, they very slowly made sure that they made their changes. They brought ourselves up with a brain which all of us probably would agree is a giving of more our mothers than our fathers. And this I am not trying to say or impose in any way. This is femininity. You know, it's not something which I am trying to say in a male-bashing way. This is natural femininity, and femininity is something which I very strongly want to point out that femininity we have made it a gender construct. It was never a gender construct. It was an anatomical construct and it was a hormonal construct. There are many men with very strong feminine qualities who are very active towards the tender aspect of their being compared to the robust or destructive aspect of their being, right? So femininity can arouse in anybody, just about anybody. That person doesn't necessarily need to be a woman only. So coming back to your question, I see that it is important to say these texts, to retell the ancient texts again and again and again, because with every era, there will be a significant change in telling these stories. And each of these telling will say a lot about that particular era. But these stories come from the fact that women then were strong, they made changes in their lives and also in the lives of others. They conducted themselves with a lot of courage without giving in to what others felt were right for them. They believed they were leaders in the way they behaved. They were leaders in the way they conducted themselves in telling the world that they too have brains. They are not just their physical temporary beauty. They are far more than that, and they are what do I say? They qualify to be legends. They say that with their actions, their words, their being, and they have proved themselves right. They are legends, right? Till date, we think of themselves, we have learned from them, we have tried to follow them, we have discussed them, even if we didn't agree with them. And that is what makes them legends. And so when you come to coming back again to your question, the fact that these are more tranquil forms of rebel instead of more aggressive forms of rebel makes it an Indian soft power, which is something that probably we are asked. You are mute. Yes.
Yeah. You have answered all my questions, and probably I guess I'm more clear about it, about the idea of sati, about the idea of panchkanya, and more about the idea of feminism, femininity, in a more natural way than I was before having a conversation with you, and even after reading your book. Thank you so much.
Niyati, I would like to ask you one question, if you permit me. May I?
Definitely, ma'am, definitely.
Niyati, you are a professor of law, which means that you have studied law. One question that comes to me very strongly is, what is your idea of dharma? And you being who you are, how do you see, where lies your dharma personally, socially, culturally?
Yeah, that's a very tough question to answer. But then I had a very early encounter with Indian thought, because my father is a Sanskrit professor who has retired recently, and my mother is still a Hindi professor at the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda. So I had this early encounter with the Sanskrit texts, because my father used to read it to me, make me read it and understand it. And I also had the Hindi versions of it, be it Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas, or be it, Rahim of, and everything. So I have, from a very young age, understood, and that dharate iti dharma. The one thing that you can follow, one thing that you can wear is dharma. So I was very clear since the beginning that dharma is not something which is related to religion. Religion is not what we believe, and dharma has always been righteousness. For me, dharma is my duty, and I imbibe it in myself with believing that, number one, I have to live in harmony with myself and with people around me. And I, although of course I'm not perfect, but then I've started, consciously taking effort to live in harmony, understanding the imperfectness of others and mine, and living in it. And secondly, living in integrity, be it in my profession, be it in my personal life, be it with my friends, family, relation, everybody. Two things that I follow is harmony and integrity, which for me is dharma. For all through my legal education, as soon as I grew up, I had interactions outside, and I used to come home and debate with my father with all the things that have been written in our scriptures, very particularly Manusmriti. And I'm still not happy with few of the answers that he gives. But then in general, in toto, if you ask me, I have become a more perfect, I am probably in, some 30, 40, 50 years, I don't know, but then probably I'll be able to uh, follow more dharma in my, not just actions, but by my words and by my thoughts everywhere. So for me, dharma is, it can be a putri dharma as a daughter, it can be stri dharma as a woman, it can be a guru dharma while I'm teaching in the class. So I try to be, I try to understand all the manifestations of dharma while performing all my roles and all my duties as true to it as possible. I'm not saying that I might be, 100% perfect while doing it, but then I try to. I introspect that here you were wrong. You were not supposed to do like that. You were not supposed to say like that. But then I have learned this because of my, understanding that I have dharma, righteousness, my duties. Because I've always felt, although I've studied in the constitution, that it's all about your fundamental rights and everything. But I felt that India and Indian culture was more about your duties. It is this, with respect to these duties, that we find the correlative rights of others. You perform your duty and you'll be able to uphold the rights of others. So this has always been my understanding of dharma.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Niyati, I got my answers.
Okay, so if you also would enlighten me, to the idea of dharma, I would try to inculcate that also.
It is not very different from what you say. I can just in 2 words say that it, dharma for me, I look at it in a way that it is a correlation between personal good and collective good. It is not just selfishly giving in to your own needs and interests. When in feminism debates, when we talk about understanding your needs, your desires, and listening to yourself, it
Coral ma'am, your voice is breaking. I guess there is some network issue. Ma'am, maybe you can turn off the video and then try speaking. We can listen you. Yes.
Better than before, but then there's still glitches.
stop video.
Yeah, it's fine now.
Yeah. So I was just saying that my understanding of dharma is very simple, and you have also spoken about it. It is about conducting myself in correlation with the person that I am and with the world that I reside in. So it is not just about my personal good, where I grow selfish, where I look at only my needs, but it is also about uh, bringing together my personal good along with the collective good, so that there is a harmonious environment that is created together personally and collectively, socially and culturally, where what I do may not be everybody's right, but what I do has a very positive uh, explanation for me at least, if not anybody else. That is the way I look at it.
Okay. So, ma'am, we have currently 2 questions.
Yes.
One is related to the topic, and other would be of your personal interest. So, I'll ask you the first question. The first question is from Atul Sir's Atharo Satakar Bangla or Bengali. Please don't mind my pronunciation. We came to know that in 18th century, the Bengali women do recite the name Panchasati, that is Ahilya, Mandodari, Tara, Kunti, Draupadi. But now the practice isn't it seen frequently. So in the colonial rule, when feminism in India took a great shape, the practice of taking them as idols got extinct. Is it another example of destruction of Indian form of feminism by Western feminism?
Could be. It is not necessarily, I mean, I don't see this, and this is very personal thought. It is not something to either counter you or agree with you. But the way I look at it, that during the colonial rule, they tried to push religion in India, which is Christian. Christianity was pushed by the British. They did it to promote themselves, not necessarily to destroy the existing ones. But yes, there was a transfer religious identity from the existing one to a new one. So that was a complicated thing. That was a complicated thing to happen. There was a lot of mind change that was happening. There was a lot of cultural change that was happening. There was a lot of ritualistic change that was happening. So, in that context, if I am talking, sitting here, reading the ethics, talking about something, and tomorrow, if I'm told that I'm not supposed to do this, I'm supposed to do something very different. So I'm supposed to, or I'm forced to accept it, but I don't accept it in my heart. If I don't accept it in my heart, I will keep in touch with my roots, whatever I am forced to. If I have accepted it with my heart, and often such acceptance comes, there is a solution to your misery. If you are not food and the church is giving food, there is no harm. I mean, I don't see anything in a person going to church, adopting Christianity, and getting that food. That is probably God's way of far to food. So, as I say, that there are different ways of looking at it, that what exactly happened. It's miserable, and a part of your misery is taken care of. You are mentally more okay to go and do that. That is when a structural change happens within your mind. And if you're forced to take up another religion, that is a mind stays in a completely different level. So it depends upon communities at that particular point of time. That is probably that is not constant. That I can definitely tell you that is not constant. It's not that what happened in Bihar, what happened in Bihar happened in Tamil. So different parts of Bengal have reacted to this particular adaptation or change of religion. They have reactions have been.
Yeah. So there's one more question. So there's a question that is related with, but then probably I guess you've answered it, but then still I'll read it for you. So there are some interrelated questions. So I'll read them. So, ma'am, how far do you think is virginity related or important in the contemporary times when we see a lot of hate crimes and atrocities being carried out against women? This is the first question. Then the second question is, Ahilya was cursed by her husband for infidelity. It was and it's considered the biggest dilemma amongst women. In the age where women are making progressive changes within the society, do you think infidelity is still something that women should fret about?
I remember the second question more than the first, so let me answer that first.
Okay.
In a very mental and spiritual construct, infidelity means that you have not been faithful. You may not be faithful to a person without giving yourself physically to anything. A lot of people in India, by that definition, are already practicing infidelity. They're not faithful to their partners, which means that they're not in love with their partner. They're fantasizing something simple. But physically, they haven't given their bodies to anybody else. Don't you call that infidelity? It is. So infidelity, this is very, very specific and personal to two people. You might feel that the next door neighbor had been practicing infidelity. Otherwise, it could have been that it is open marriage. There are terms like that these days. Open marriage. I don't exactly know what it is, but then it exists. So we call open marriage infidelity. Everything is happening according to each other's consent. So consent doesn't mean that it is not infidelity. But then the have given their bodies to someone else, and they have hurt themselves. Infidelity itself is a very personal term. It is not a social term. That's the first question.
Ma'am, the first question was related to.
Virginity.
Am I audible? Yeah,
Yeah.
the first question related to virginity, but I guess you've answered it.
Okay.
So I would take it to the last question, and the last question was probably by a budding writer who wants to know that what advice would you like to give to writers, to young writers?
Observe. Is the most underrated skill that people don't talk about. Observe. Keep your eyes open. Keep your mind open. Constantly learn from the world around. And when I say learn, it doesn't mean that you have to mug up things. You have to try and take doctrines. You don't have to. If you are looking at the garden, you will learn how a bird sits on the branch and tries to look for food around. If you are traveling by road, you will learn how a street child is trying to make his daily living. All these things, the more you observe, they will come to you in some form or the other in your writing. Whatever I do write today is an accumulation of everything that I have observed all my life. So very consciously observe what is happening around. These days we don't observe. When we were children, I come from Bengal, where we were specially trained to observe. We were more in touch with nature. Our parents pointed out certain things that we must take note of. I'm sure the same happened in every community, depending upon what they believed was their specialty. But now we don't have time to observe, or we don't consider observation as a skill at all. We are quick to make opinions. We must say something because this time will pass, and then something that I wanted to say will become obsolete. So I must say it now. I miss the opportunity of observing what is happening. It is very important to observe. And the more you will observe, you will write better. So all those opinions which you wanted to write on Facebook and get 30 likes, you might write in a book and sell 100 copies. You'll get some likes. I hope that answers the question.
Niyati ma'am, can you hear us? I guess you have some issues, connectivity issues. Okay, thank you, ma'am. Maybe we can move on to the vote of thanks. Shivani, please.
Yes, sir. Namaste. I wish you a memorable evening to you all. I deem it is great honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks for this great event on the behalf of my team. First and foremost, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for Coral Ma'am for her presence and memorable words and views upon her book Ahilya. My heartfelt thanks to Niyati ma'am for her thoughtful questions and wonderful insights. I thank you both of you for sparing time from your busy schedule and to mark your presence. We are also grateful to our organization Think India and all the members to make this event possible. Last but most important, I must thank our attendees. I thank you all for your participation. It's audiences like you that make the event successful. Once again, thank you all.
Thank you, Shivani, Niyati, and Think India. It was indeed a great pleasure being with you.
Thank you,
Thank
ma'am.
you, ma'am. We wish you a lot of success for this book and for all your future endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, and all the best.